suggest you get your notebooks out because much of tonight's material will appear on the Blue Book examinations which follow this semester. That means you better be on the stick tonight. Now, wait a minute. Excuse me while I light my totally hip pipe. I mean, you got to get things right. Look at that thing, please. Yeah. There he is. The start of the We'd like to, before we get deeply underway here tonight, before we get totally involved in the in our Kierkegaardian roamings.
Plymouth Duster is a rare breed of economy car because it is small enough yet still big enough. And along with other Plymouth compacts, Duster's a leader in its class in resale value. But what's rarer yet is Duster's quality. Quality that shines and shows in every line.
Coming through one of the best years Chrysler Plymouth ever known.
Some years are good car years. Others are vintage years. When you see Duster, you'll know 71 has been a vintage year for Chrysler Plymouth.
71 is the year that has come through for you.
And now it's final clearance.
Chrysler Plymouth, coming through. Chrysler Plymouth, right for you. Chrysler Plymouth, coming through.
I got a great letter from a pilot the other day. He's an American Airlines pilot, and he said whenever they're out flying at 38,000 feet, he says he and his buddy, who's his co-pilot, he says when everything is working fine, he's got everything under control, he says they switch over to their ADF channel. Now, do you know what the ADF channel is on a? Well, the ADF, you see, is a system of it's a direction finding system. And on that system, they can tune in broadcast stations. And they hone in on a broadcast station. He says, we hone in on WOR. Yeah, that's right. And he says, we are flying, he says, maybe at 38,000 feet. And he says, we're thousands of miles from WOR. He says, we may be out over San Francisco. He says, they come in like a ton of bricks up in this upper atmosphere. It's way up there, see? And he says, we can tune in everything. And he says, and all of a sudden, in comes Shepard. He says, you come drifting into our cockpit, he says, at 38,000 feet, and we're flying out over the Rockies. He says, an eerie sensation. He said, and all around us, we see the blinking lights of our control panels. And he said, and the other night, you did a show about flying. And he says, suddenly everything in the cockpit was transformed. He says, for the first time in weeks, he said, my co-pilot sat up straight in his seat. He says he slumps a lot. And his mother's often worried about that because, it does things to your back and that. He sat up straight, and he says, and for 42 minutes, we listened to your saga of your first solo. He says, we sat there, he says, you're absolutely right, that the first solo that a man makes, but there's only one first solo, let's face it. The first moment you fly an airplane off the deck by yourself is a moment that is absolutely unforgettable. Do you agree, Bob? It's an unforgettable moment. And there's this terrible instant in your mind. See, he wrote me and he says, Shepard, he says, I've got to have a tape of that show. He says, because hardly anybody who's a non-flyer can understand what it feels like, that moment. He said, you reproduced it exactly. He said, that instant when the plane leaves the ground and the ground falls away and you have this momentary sensation that you don't remember anything about it. Why? Well, all the instruments look like little blobs with needles flicking. He said, you keep looking at the clock trying to figure out what your altitude is. He says, it's a terrible moment. And yet, on the other hand, it's a fantastically exhilarating moment. It's the first moment of total freedom in a man's life. And do you know what I mean, Bob? And I thought of that when you walked in. I thought that did you solo in a PT-17? The Great Lakes. Yeah, beautiful biplane. It is one of the most beautiful aircraft ever built. And this airplane, then when you walked in, I remembered your stories of flying the 17, which was called the Yellow Peril by some people. It was always yellow. Was the one you flew bright yellow? Yeah, of course. It had two wings. One wing, yeah, blue. The body was blue and the wings were yellow. Lovely little aircraft. And you know why they painted them that color? Because students were flying them. And they figured... And they wanted to make sure that no matter where the student flew it, into the top of the poplar trees, or he flew it 280 degrees off of his expected course and flew it out to sea, they could see him. See, so his airplane was painted a bright, bright yellow. It's a day glow yellow almost. Beautiful, clear, bright yellow. And I'll never forget the first time that I saw the PT-17. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, the PT-17 is a classic airplane today. In fact, if you can find a good PT-17 that is, reconstructable, it's as valuable as a classic automobile. And there are some still around flying. The first day I saw the PT, so long, Bob. It's a pleasure, really. Yeah, I know, but it's a funny thing how certain people remind you of certain things. Now, when Bob Smith, the general manager of WOR, just walked into the control room, most people, seeing the boss, would be reminded of their paycheck, or they would be reminded of the fact they're liable to get a pink slip any minute. The minute Bob walked in, I was reminded of the PT-17. He's an ex-flyer. And, of course, there's no such thing as an ex-flyer. No, there isn't. There really is not. Any more than there's no such thing as an ex-mother. You cannot. It's a condition of man that you can't resign from. You cannot resign from having once flown. You can say that he's an inactive flyer. You can say he's a flyer who is not flying. But to say a man is an ex-flyer is nonsense. There's no such thing as an ex-flyer. And if you have an old man around your house who once flew B-17s or something, he is still a flyer. And incidentally, he knows a lot about life that he is never able to transmit to you, because when you've once flown an aircraft, yes, when you once really flown an aircraft off the deck, and you've been in charge, you've flown this machine, it is something which it's an indescribable moment, and it changes a man forever. Forever. He can never go back. He can never return to the innocence that he once knew. And have you ever noticed around pilots' eyes, there's an odd look around the eyes. Pilots and doctors have the same look around the eyes. Now, why? Well, because a doctor knows something you don't know. He knows about mortality. You suspect it at times, but he knows. And it changes the look in the eye of a man. He has a very different view of the world than those who are the innocent. Now, what about pilots? Well, a pilot has pretty much the same reason. He has an intimation of mortality, and he realizes how frail man is. And why he realizes it? Well, because I think when you fly an airplane, you also see this look in the eyes of certain kinds of sailors. Because once you deal with basic forces, you know something about man. You learn about man from the fact that you have wrestled with a tornado. Oh, man, do you. And the average city guy, the guy who's lived all of his life, and this is one of the reasons why so many students can be so very blithe about things, because many students have never faced any of the great forces. In fact, few students have. The really great forces. I'm talking about the vast forces of nature, which you cannot picket out of existence. You're not going to, no matter how many signs you print, Hurricane Myrtle is still going to blow you 400 miles into the Gulf, friend. and it's not going to give a damn about it when it does it. And no matter how much you may shake your fist at the heavens, man has an allotted time on Earth. And it is there. That's something the doctor knows about. He's very aware of it. Now, on the other hand, what about the pilot? Well, the pilot learns something about these forces, and he can't ignore them. Most of you, day by day, can ignore gravity. For example, you just walk around, you don't think about gravity. How many of you ever think about the direction of the wind? This is in the pilot's mind all the time. How many of you think much about the velocity of the wind? It's in the pilot's mind constantly when he is flying. How many of you think that any minute now you may have to abort? What would you do? Well, now, you're walking along 6th Avenue. You never always constantly in your mind have an escape hatch going, do you? Well, this is not so of a pilot. The pilot, one of the first things he learns is, as he may look very casual. He's flying along, you see, and he's looking out. You see him flying. He's looking out of the windshield, and he's leaning back in his bucket seat, and he may be having a cigarette, and you think, now, there's a guy, he's got on top of it, he's cooling it. But all the while, in his mind, he sees a constant parade to either side of him, a marching parade of potential landing sites. All the time. Did you know that, Jerry? On top of that, he is always calculating how high he is above the earth and how far he can glide and how long he can glide if he loses all power, which is very important. You see, if your escape field is 9.5 miles away and you can only glide 8.5 miles, it ain't no escape field. I mean, it's just a field, that's all. And so, all the while, he's calculating all these things. On the other hand, he's also calculating constantly in his mind, at any given altitude, what the wind velocity and direction is. And it's invisible. And so, as you're sitting in that big jet plane flying along, most people are totally unaware of the forces that are working on this thing. And at the altitudes that they fly, are you aware that at the altitudes that a jet plane flies, let's say the average a cross-continental jet, you get in this jet and they're flying at 38,000 feet. Do you have any concept of the wind velocities at that altitude? Well, I will say that they quite often exceed 100 miles an hour. That's called the jet stream, which you hear Dr. Frank Fields talk about occasionally. But that jet stream whistles, man. Now, it may be behind you, it may be in front of you, it may be coming from the side, but no matter where it comes from, and no matter how fast you go, it is exerting a vector force on you. It's exerting a big force. And so the aircraft is constantly, the pilot, of course, and it's all computed and everything else, he's constantly checking and making adjustments for that vast wind that is blowing him one way or the other, continually. He's always conscious of, now like you take your automobile, how many of you are continually conscious of the fuel that's in your car? You are. Well, that's because you're trying to drive it all the time with 1.5 gallons in it, friend. And you could always tell pilots, for one thing, the average pilot, when he drives his car, I didn't intend to do an airplane show tonight, but the average, and I'm not, by the way, but people are fascinated by flying, and they should know something about it. You know that the average pilot, after he's gotten involved in flying a good deal, he does things by pure, learned reflex, by responses that he automatically has. So when I go into a gas station with my car, I never ask for anything less than top it off. Now, why is this? Is it because Shepard is profligate, and he's got all that dough and he can spend it? Yes, he's got dough, that's right. Is it because he likes to throw it around? No. It's because as a pilot, you automatically think in terms of topping it off. And so when an aircraft is refueled, unless you have certain gross weight problems, which is something else, you generally say top it off so that you know exactly how much fuel you've got. And you like that big overage involved. Now, anyway, this letter from these pilots was great because he said that we listened to you in the cockpit. Now, I'll tell you even more than that in case you're curious about people listening to you. That doesn't mean he's inattentive. No, not at all. Because quite often in the aircraft, they will tune in a radio station like WOR, some big radio station, and they will continually check their ADF and their other navigational aids against that particular known spot. They know where WOR is. And so we're here on the East Coast, and we're broadcasting at 50,000 watts, and we're putting a lot of power into the air. And quite often I'll get letters, say, from Paris, for example. Or I even got a letter here not too long ago from a guy in Brussels, a pilot who was flying his aircraft, an American pilot, who tracked us all the way to just over the Brussels airport. And he says as we came down, as we descended into the landing pattern over Brussels, he said we could hear the signal slowly fading out until when I hit, and he gave me the exact altitude that he lost WOR. You curious? He lost it at exactly 17,000 feet as it began to descend into Brussels. And he said at that point, you just faded right out. He says, but you were coming in like a ton of bricks over the continent. And it was on a Saturday night show, incidentally, he was listening to. So right now there are probably pilots, who knows how many thousands of miles away, who are listening to the show. Well, if you are, you're listening to... Oh, by the way, speaking of pilots, I'll do a little more on airplanes here, if you don't mind. That a little milestone was just passed that went probably unrecorded by the press, and quite conceivably even by most of the aviation press. A little milestone last month was just recorded. They just issued the 2 millionth airman certificate. And since they began to license pilots, in the early days, Orville Wright didn't have to apply for a license, and they didn't. And in those days, in the early days of flying, really the early days, the guys would get certificates from various flying schools and structures and so forth. And you'd have this flying thing that would be signed. You know who one of the great teachers was in the original days of flying? Was Orville Wright. And that there are people around, still alive, who have flying certificates that have been signed by Orville Wright. They learned under the master, And so it wasn't until somewhere around the mid-20s that they began to actually issue government-issued airman certificates. That's what a pilot's license is officially called, airman certificate. And they just issued the 2 millionth airman certificate. And they were both for the same rating. The first one, airman certificate number 1, was issued in 1927. Can you imagine having number 1 on your license? and it was a private pilot, and it was private pilot license. And airman certificate number 2 million was just issued, and it was issued to a Navy lieutenant who had gotten his private pilot license, and it was number 2 million. Mine is number something like 1,800,000 something. I could give you the exact number, but it's not important because all pilots carry that with them. But it's 1,800,000 something. So you can see at what point I got my pilot's license. And to own an airman, you know that you're licensed for life. Then this is something most people. That doesn't mean that you're legally you're legal to fly for life. You are licensed for life, and you must be re-examined periodically, physically re-examined, depending on the class of license you have. They have a stringent physical examination that the pilot must pass periodically. Not by his home family doctor either, by the way, but by an FAA doctor. And then you are reissued a medical certificate, which you must carry always with your airman certificate. Now, the airman certificate, the basic certificate, is basically a private pilot's license. It isn't really called that. It's called Single Engine Land, SEL, if you're curious. That's Airman Certificate, Single Engine Land. And after that, then any notations that are made on that certificate are additional qualifications. For example, if you obtain an instrument rating, that is then added to your license. You may then obtain let's say a multi-engine rating, which is added to your license. Then you may get a commercial license, which is really added to your basic license. It isn't a new license, really. It's a basic addenda to your original license, until ultimately you can go all the way on up and get what they call. The ultimate license is an ATR, in case you're curious. An ATR is the Air Transport Rating, and that is issued under certain very stringent, long, involved preparations. But, getting back to the PT-17, this is the airplane that thousands and thousands and thousands of military pilots trained on. And they trained on this airplane well up into the 50s, I believe, something like that, the early 50s. But it's a beautiful little aircraft. It's a classical biplane, nothing to do with World War I type airplanes. Most people tend to think of the biplane as an old type aircraft. It's merely a different type. You know, they still build biplanes, not as curios, but as a specific type of aircraft. And the biplane, for example, is still considered the premier aerobatic aircraft. And so you'll find many magnificent airplanes that are flown today in aerobatic competition. Incidentally, that brings up another subject. Am I boring you about this stuff? You know, a lot of people don't know about flying. Do you know that one of the fastest growing, highly skilled sports in the world is the skill that it takes to be a qualified aerobatic pilot? And, boy, this is unbelievable, what some guys can do with an airplane. Do you know who the U.S. champion is? Many of you don't know. In fact, he's one of about a half dozen men in the world that are world-class aerobatic pilots. World-class. And they have world competitions. And some of the leading aerobatic pilots in the world are Russians. But the big difference is this, that the Russians, of course, like most of their sports, have government backing. In other words, you may be an airplane pilot who works for the Army or the Navy over in Russia, and you will be singled out for aerobatic training, and you'll be given all this tremendous equipment and money and so forth involved, until ultimately you become a great world aerobatic flyer. But, of course, it is, again, government subsidy. But our pilots are not. They simply fly on their own. And you can imagine what a fantastically expensive hobby it must be. They are not rich men, by the way. The particular man who happens to be the leading aerobatic flyer in the United States is anything but a rich man, but all of it's all funneled, you see, and he is considered one of the great geniuses in the air. Fantastic pilot. He's as at home in the air as, let's say, as Tom Seaver is on the mound. And in many ways, even more so, because, and by the way, no good aerobatic pilot is really a top aerobatic pilot, until he's in his early or middle 40s, because it takes that much training, that much tremendous experience, that much knowledge of wind and currents, and that much knowledge of aircraft and machinery. You just can't simply learn it. It's something you have to absorb, you know. So it's just like there's no 12-year-old pitchers that win World Series ball games. Just ain't going to happen. This is WOR New York.
Here's a song you've heard before. We've been singing it and saying it because it's our pledge to you.
Chrysler Plymouth.
Our pledge is to bring you the kind of cars you want, not only in styling, size, and price, but in quality that shines and shows in every line. Like in our full-size Plymouth Fury and even bigger-size Chrysler Royal. Cars you can live with for many years to come, because while some years are good car years, 71 has been a vintage year for Chrysler Plymouth.
71, the year that has come through for you.
And now they're final clearance priced.
Chrysler Plymouth, coming through. Chrysler Plymouth, right for you. Chrysler Plymouth, coming through.
But do you know the name of the great pilot that is currently our U.S. world champion? He's a fantastic pilot. He's considered one of the greatest aerobatic pilots to ever be developed in the United States. I'll let that settle there. You know, speaking of the PT-17, the first time I ever saw PT-17s, I was a kid, see, and my old man one day he says, "Listen," he said, "we're going to take a trip." He said, "We're going to go out and we're going to look at the airplanes." He loved to go and look at airplanes at the airport. Well, we went out to this airport, which was a different airport than we usually went to. We went out to the airport, and they were having a public day where people could come, just the ordinary public. And that day, we went up to the Naval Air Station that was attached to Great Lakes. You know the Great Lakes training station there, the big Navy base, and they have a Naval Air Station there that's attached to it. And we drove up there. My old man was one of these guys. I'll tell you one thing. I will always be thankful to him for one thing. He went to everything that was free. And I might point out, I suspect that many of you suspected it, but never quite articulated it, that almost all the free stuff is generally the stuff that ultimately is the great stuff of our time. That by free stuff, I mean if you attend a gigantic parade, you know, and 50 years from now there will be pictures in the paper that says gigantic parade that was held to protest etc. in the 1970s, and there you were, you know, you were actually there. And so the old man he'd always look in the paper about Friday night and figure out what's going to be free, see, that he could go to. And he loved, by the way, he loved traffic jams. Yes, I mean, let's face it, there are some people who are at their best when they are mired hock deep in problems. And the old man loved traffic jams. He would love, some of his great stories were about, traffic jams that he had survived. It's like old soldiers that talk about great battles that they were in. The old man, he'd say, I remember him sitting here talking to Uncle Carl. He said, "Look, Carl, that's nothing." And Carl would look a little crushed because he knew he was talking to the great traffic jam fighter of them all, see? He'd say, "That's nothing." He says, "You think you had a traffic jam out of diversity? That's ridiculous. Did I ever tell you about the time I went to the All-Star game in Soldiers Field? That traffic jam lasted for over 3 weeks. As a matter of fact, there were some men sitting there when the first snows came down. And they were..." of course, poor old Carl would be in tears, and the old man would go on and on about how his car ran out of gas 4 times just making it, in that 34 miles in the traffic jam. And how, he'd go on. Like, there would be 3 model changes of certain cars before the guy got home, But nevertheless, he loved great traffic jams. And so one of my most clear memories of my father was always sitting in the back seat of the car with sweat running down his back and him hollering out the window of the car, at somebody else. And that's one of my most clear memories of him. And there it is, And he was a fantastic, he was a guerrilla fighter, and as a guerrilla fighter, he knew the terrain, he knew the country, he knew all shortcuts, he knew exactly how much he could pull, he knew exactly, how he could make it around what gas stations you could cut through without getting busted, and he's great, And he would have made a fantastic ambulance driver. But the old man, you see, sitting in the front seat, hollering, and when all else failed, his head would go out the window, and this long, low, purring, humming stream of magnificently controlled profanity would begin to ooze out over the neighborhood, see. And you could see other veterans. The old man would once in a while see another veteran that he recognized, from a traffic jam several months before. He'd see some guy's Pontiac with the hood up and the smoke coming out. He'd say, "Hey, there's that guy that we saw. Remember the time we went to the beach? There he is. Hey, oh!" And they'd holler back and forth, and, they'd exchange stories and so on. In fact, they even used to have battle patches. These guys, they put on their driving sweater, like the survivor of the big July 4th Oak Park Beach traffic jam, which is still talked about in Chicago, legendary, Some people never got home. It's just they were lost forever, you see. And so he lived, in traffic jams. But nevertheless, he took us to this place out there by Great Lakes. And, of course, it was a fantastic traffic jam because all the other freeloaders in the world were there. And we were lined up for miles. It's at 6 o'clock in the morning. He always went from the crack of dawn to be... He wanted to be first in the traffic jam, He wanted to really get in the middle of it, So he would be in the middle. You see a great sea of cars, Oldsmobiles, Pontiacs, Hudsons, and everything else all around. About every 24th car, there was always one with the hood up, with great clouds of steam coming out of it. And the little fat guy running around with rust all over his vest, yelling like mad. Kids crying. And, of course, instantly, like the vultures, wherever there's a great crowd of cars, always immediately the guys with these little ice cream things show up. They're like vultures, going up and down between the selling people, popsicles and the whole jazz. And the old man is sitting in the car all the time. And we finally got onto the field, or at least in this fantastic parking lot that was attached to the field. Tremendous. Oh, it was out in the country there, see. And up above us, you could see these airplanes flying around. I'm flipping, and immediately I'm flipping. Kids automatically relate to several things. Airplanes. There's no kid alive that doesn't relate to an airplane. Automatic. And irregardless of sex, automatically you flip over airplanes. Kids automatically flip over horses. Automatic. I mean, I've never seen a kid not look at a horse. It's automatic. Kids also automatically flip over large dogs. Very large. You agree with me there? Large dogs. These are very basic elements. And so when you can get them all together, horses, dogs, and airplanes, you really got a mess. But nevertheless, the airplanes are flying over, and the old man flies. We jump out of the car, and we get into this tremendous crowd. Gee, a fantastic crowd. And there were guys. It was such a big crowd that they were selling periscopes. Where you could stand in the middle of this vast mass of humanity and look up. Of course, that was immediately defeated because everybody bought a periscope. And there you were looking at the back of the next guy's periscope is what you looked at all afternoon. So as a kid, see, I would occasionally climb up the side of my old man, like you climb up a tree. And I would sit on his shoulder or something. I'd look up, and I remember seeing these little yellow airplanes. They look like airplane models. Beautiful little airplanes. And they were flying them in formation. They would come down and making landings in formation. They had these big, great runways. Actually, it was a tremendous field, as you might know. It's a naval field. And these guys were doing formation landings, is the thing I remember. They'd come down in a big V, just drift down in a V. And, of course, everybody's looking, and they had these smoke pots, which they were using, to give you a little more pizzazz, a little more dramatics. And the smoke pots would be drifting. You saw these 8 planes or 7 planes coming down this V formation. They drift, and they would all touch just simultaneously. Fantastic. And the crowd would cheer, see? They would roll out, and then they were doing touch and goes. And they would roll out maybe 200-300 yards, and then they would all go up again as a group. Ooh, we're flipping. The old man is sweating and yelling and hollering and sucking on a popsicle. And, it was a fantastic day. So the PT-17, in case you're curious, and by the way, the PT-17 is an airplane that is often used to fake World War I movies. Many movies, when you see, current movies, World War I type movies like the Blue Max and so forth, they'll have, you'll see Fokkers, or what you think are Fokkers, and Spads and Newports. And actually, a lot of them are PT-17s, or kindred type airplanes, which have been faked up. They put a fake cowl on it, and they put a fake tail on the back. And so when you see it in the movie, you're actually looking at a training plane, which was used and is still used by. Do you know that only until very recently, this surprised a lot of people who may not know this, until very recently, World War II fighter planes, authentic World War II fighter planes, were still in use as frontline fighters by several countries around the world, including the Messerschmitt 109. I'm talking about the famous, World War I, or rather World War II German fighter. And did you any of you get a chance to see the Battle of Britain, which was a movie about mostly World War II air combat and so forth? But if you're at all an airplane cuckoo, you would be interested in some of the airplanes they used in that, and probably you know all about them anyway. But most of those were taken from the Spanish Air Force, which are, using them frontline DO-17s, Dornier 17 bombers, for example. And it's odd to think that a lot of this stuff is still being used. You know that the old the famous old Ford Trimotor, which you've probably seen pictures of, is still in operation around the world, and I'm not talking about as a museum piece, but is actually being used in certain places. This will throw you. Do you know that the last, I believe it was the last quarter, that the largest number of operational commercial flights compiled by a single aircraft, they keep these records all over the world, in the last quarter was by the DC-3. Now, do you know anything about the DC-3? A lot of people think of this, as an old. It is an old airplane, but the point is, it is still running, and there are people who predict. There are people who in the aviation world who predict that by the year 2000, DC-3s that were built in the early 30s will still be running operationally and commercially. Now how's that for a piece of equipment that is genuinely a classic? And if you go out here if you drive out past Newark Airport now, when you let's say you go through, take the Holland Tunnel. You go through the Holland Tunnel, and you come up there by the Newark Airport, and you cut up there by Route 22 and all those areas where it says Route 1, when that big circle is. When you drive up there, take a look over at the hangar area of the airport, Newark Airport. You will see, parked right by Route 1 there, a magnificent DC-3 that is owned by some company. It's an operational plane, but it's just sitting right there. And this DC-3, by the way, was built in 1934. And it's still operating, and so the airplane is not to be compared with the car. The airplane is practically has no real lifespan. I don't know how I got started on all this, but nevertheless, there it is. That maybe a lot of you didn't realize that we are listened to by large numbers of pilots who hear WOR at this time. How are you, man? I mean, up there. Keep your airspeed up, boys. There you go, Watch out for that turbulence, Let's go. Hey, by the way, speaking of turbulence, how much time do we have, Jerry? Quick. 10? Only 10 minutes? Listen, I don't know whether I should say this for later or not, but I've got a very important note here to make here that just came in for those of you who keep up on world movements, world events. Do you know what's happening right now, currently, at this minute? Well, right now, at this very instant, the Lemmings of northern Scandinavia, whose two biggest mass migrations from their mountain pastures this century appear to coincide with world tension and wars, are now on the march toward death again, right this minute. Did you hear the middle part of that paragraph there? That oddly enough, historians and people who look at things like that have noticed that the two greatest migrations of the Lemmings in Scandinavia in this century occurred during World War I and World War II, just prior to. And they say now another fantastic migration has begun. You missed that one, didn't you? I mean, this is not trivia. This is what's happening in the world, friends. This is the kind of stuff you never hear on the news, And it's the sneakiest stuff. You're constantly hearing a speech by a politician or by some, by some student leader or something like that, some guy leading a strike or something. But you never hear the really sinister stuff. The migration is begun. Hundreds of thousands of the small black and tan. Give me a little of that lemming music, that big lemming music. There it goes. No, that ain't lemming. No, kill it quick, friends. If you think that's lemming music. Yes, they are marching. Hundreds of thousands of the tiny black and tan Arctic rodents are now streaming south, mainly in Finland. And they are moving out of the hills, out of the mountains, out of the great glaciers. Thousands, and not, in fact, millions of lemmings tonight, this minute, right this instant, are on the march. They will drown almost to the last lemming in lakes, rivers, and then finally the North Sea. The headlong suicidal rush, which turns the usually timid creature into a furiously aggressive and reckless cannibal, takes place to some degree every few years and is a spectacle without parallel in human life. The biggest migrations of modern times took place in 1918 and in 1938, just before the beginning of World War II. Think carefully about that, friends. When breeding conditions for the lemmings were excellent, they somehow sensed the war coming, and then they moved. These animals, whose powers of procreation are formidable, are one of the few species of wild life which suffer from stress, just like modern man. They hate being crowded. If world politicians choose to disregard the Lap legend, and it's an old legend among Laplanders, that the Lemming March is a bad omen, an omen of world disaster, perhaps the Suicide March should at least serve as a warning to urban planners. The periodic self-destruction is seen by scientists as nature's way of preserving the species when a population explosion threatens to exhaust the mountain vegetation on which they depend. And here's the most sinister, most evil part of it all. When the stampede starts, nothing can stop it. The lemming hordes pour through the countryside following natural geographic lines to the sea. They invade towns, destroy crops, pollute lakes and waterways with millions of their dead bodies. Those which have remained in the mountains, although ravaged by disease, malnutrition, and animals of prey, have a better chance of survival. The vast horde of lemmings that move in a great crowd die almost to the last lemming. So, friend, if you're thinking, you mean 10 minutes again? So if you're thinking of moving to the big city, if you're thinking of packing up and coming to New York, forget it. In fact, you know that one of the problems that we're facing today in this country is a vast cityward movement. You know, to look at the hippie world, you would suspect that it's the other way around. You know, the communes and the countries and all that stuff. Not so. That every major city in the world is suffering from this vast horde of people who are coming to the city. It's like a migration. And these migrations have occurred at different times in history. For example, there was a tremendous migration just before the Civil War of people who packed up and left and came to the towns. In fact, there's there's a song written about that. You know that one of the great songs of World War I was an Irving Berlin song that had to do with that exact phenomena. How you going to keep them down on a farm once they've seen gay Paris? And there is something about the life of the city which attracts millions of people without any reason. It's inchoate. In fact, the other day I was riding in the back seat of a cab, and I was with a Puerto Rican cab driver, and we got talking about that. And it was a real bad day. We were in the middle of traffic, millions of cars on 6th Avenue, and the smoke and the crud and the drifting haze of carbon monoxide and cars on all sides and the heat and the whole bit. You know, he's sitting up there sweating, and I'm sitting in the back sweating. And he was listening to the radio, and we're looking out of the window, just sitting there, nothing happening. And I look up at the front. I always like to take a look at the hack license, the guy's name on the front there. See, and it says, "Hey, Jose." And he looks and I says, "Yeah." I says, "Jose, what do you think it is?" "Oh, bad, very bad." And I said, "Why did you come from Puerto Rico?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, you know, have you ever wondered, you know, back there, you think you're better now than you were then, even though you probably didn't make any money there?" No. So worse, actually worse. So I got robbed last month twice. Which incidentally happens among lemmings. That the crime problem ultimately is not really a racial problem nor a problem of poverty. I suspect that it's ultimately a problem of the lemming world that we live in. Just like the lemmings, which are very docile and kind to one another when they're living their normal life. The lemmings don't attack each other in normal life. The minute that millions of them are crowded together, they become ferocious cannibals. They kill each other relentlessly and eat each other. Remember, the lemming is normally a vegetarian. Now that's a very interesting thing to think about. That the more you crowd people together, the more you get them in one great vast horde of humanity, I suspect the more you're going to have the cannibal tendency. Now, how is man a cannibal? Well, he's a philosophical cannibal, not necessarily a literal cannibal. He doesn't necessarily sit down and eat the haunch of his next-door neighbor. What he does is steal his bicycle. Or what he does is hit him on the head and take his wallet. And so ultimately, the problem that we're living in, this fantastic city world that we're evolving, this urban world, has many parallels in the lemming world. And of course, immediately a lot of people are going to yell that we're not lemmings. Yes, but we are animals. We may not be lemmings, but we're animals. And I'm going to get millions of tracts now already. I can see the tracts. That's spelled with a T-R-A-C-T-S. Millions of tracts are going to arrive assuring me that we are not animals and that we are some kind of a higher, rarefied being, which is not at all to be paralleled with the animal world. In fact, you can look it up in the big book. It says right there that we're not. Well, that's highly questionable. In fact, I'm questioning it and flatly saying I believe we are animals. And the burden of proof is up to the people who believe we're not. But nevertheless, the tendency to cannibalize is a very obvious one. You get large numbers of men together, and you are going to have stealing. This is a great problem in for example, in the armed forces. You get 38 guys in the barracks. Inevitably, there's 3 or 4 guys who suddenly take to picking stuff up, which they wouldn't have done ordinarily in the ordinary life. Just wouldn't have occurred to them. You get this in college dormitories. You get a whole bunch of guys together, instantly 4 or 5 of them start doing things. And it's just a fact of nature. It's a fact of life. And these lemmings, right this minute, here it is, it's a July night, and we're sitting here in July, and it's warm, and we're kind of civilized, aren't we, friend? And here we are. You see, have you ever watched guys in a traffic jam? Man, they are absolutely, they'll kill each other. Listen, you learn this when you ever ride a motorcycle. See, people tend to hide behind their cars. You just see a lot of cars. But I've seen guys cut each other off. I've seen guys do things which are murderous things, because a car can be a murderous weapon. I've seen guys drive other guys right off the road in the middle of a traffic mess, just to make another 8 seconds of time. In short, their concern is far more, it overrides their general humanity, which they may have in their ordinary life. And the traffic jam is very close to a lemming migration. It's a great sense, and usually to the sea, oddly enough. Most migrations are water migrations of all animals. That if you find a great migration of animals, let's say in Africa, they are migrating because the water has disappeared, and they are migrating towards a great river. And now, a little more lemming music, please. Right at this minute, there are millions and millions of cars coming home or going to, involved in a vast seaward, lakeward, riverward, waterward migration. just like the lemmings. Some of them will die in the process. In fact, large numbers of them will die in the process, according to the U.S. Safety Department. And the lemmings march on, hurling themselves relentlessly into the sea. Good luck, lemming. You know, the lemming is closely related to the gerbil. Did you know that? and more guys today, more and more sociologists today are studying animal behavior, and I'm not talking about rat in a maze behavior. They're studying animal natural behavior in natural habitat to find out why man does the things he does. Now, that doesn't mean the assumption always follows that if we find out why man does a certain thing, we can do something about it. That is really one of the great misapprehensions or miscomprehensions of knowledge. That to know that man is a carnivore is not to be able to do something about it. If you know a lion eats meat, what are you going to do about it? Even if the lion knows it, what's he going to do about it? And so as we march on, is that it now? I hear the bugles. You can't escape. Speaking of animals and bears and lions and all the rest of it, there's a little note here from London. One good note. A spokesman for Regent's Park Zoo said that as the result of London's clean air policy, they've been having a whole thing about pollution over there, the polar bears are now whiter. That's kind of a good news. Says the polar bears are now whiter. He says they used to be a yellowish, grimy color, despite spending most of their time in the pool. And now the London Regent's Park Zoo polar bears are beautiful, clean, crystal polar bear white. So who knows, something is good in the wind. But I want to say to the rest of all you lemmings, by the way, I don't set myself apart. I'm as much a lemming as the rest of them. It just happens that I'm a loudmouth lemming. Just not quite the same as the rest of them. We just, you may be, if the shoe fits, friend,